welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at the 28th President of the United States, President Woodrow Wilson, the only president in American history to hold a PhD. And Chris, what I like about it, it was a PhD in history.
Yes, and not only that, but he has some local ties to our community as well, doesn't he?
Yes, his father, the Reverend Joseph Williams, who was a Presbyterian minister, actually was a pastor of a Presbyterian church down the road in Wilmington. So he has connections to southeastern North Carolina, and he was born in Virginia, just a few hundred miles north of here in Stanton, Virginia, on December 28, 1856. He's going to attend college for a little while anyway here in North Carolina, Davidson College, before transferring to Princeton University. He's going to attend law school at the University of Virginia, and he's going to get his PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University.
One of the things I find interesting as we do these podcasts is we have the opportunity to discover things about the history of these individuals that we didn't know. And we think about Woodrow Wilson and how he led the nation through the World War, and we understand his fight for the League of Nations, but the reality is that from the very beginning of his birth up until his rise to the presidency, Wilson had a very secret background that many people, even today, don't know that this president was carrying this huge risk that could have been very instrumental in changing the course of history in America.
Yeah, he was a sickly man. I think it'd be safe to say he was a sickly person, and it's going to come to light actually his as you called it, secret backgrounds, some history of his illnesses that he was covering up. It's going to come to light, Chris, at a moment when he and the world and the nation desperately didn't need it to come to light, because his mission with the League of Nations is going to fail. He spent 6 months from late December 1918 until June of 1919 in Europe trying to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, which of course would end World War I, and he wanted to promote this idea of a League of Nations. And he's going to come back to the United States, and it's going to fail. The Republicans in Congress are going to want to have nothing to do with it. So he's going to set out, Chris, to go to the American people, go over the head of Congress, talk to the American people, and get them, sort of, I guess you could say, to pressure Congress and get the League of Nations passed. And that's when his past is going to catch up with him.
We all know that the role of the President of the United States is a very stressful one. It's full of many demands on your time, and you have to think through a lot of critical issues, and it takes a lot of rigor and stamina, and also to be able to react and act at various times throughout your presidency during times of crisis. And really, for Woodrow Wilson, from the beginning of his life, he was desperate to keep secret some serious health effects that he had. And I remember that as a young boy, that he was unable to identify all of the letters of the alphabet until he was 9 years old. And it was not until he was 12 years old that he learned to read. And you just mentioned that here's this PhD graduate who didn't really have the opportunity to read anything until he was 12 years of age. And we later discovered that possibly the reason that he had such a difficult time is that he might have had a stroke early on in his childhood. And we didn't know it back then, but sometimes in certain cases of a stroke that the victim would be unable to read, but would still be able to retain the ability to talk. And so as we look a little bit later about the strokes that Wilson had later on in his life, we have to wonder if his helplessness as a young reader stemmed from maybe these unrecorded occurrences of the same trauma at a young age. So what we do know is that growing up, the disability that he had, the struggles that he had, it was very agonizing, it was very difficult, and so he recognized that he was a slow reader, and so he tried to make amends for that. And one of the things that he did is he develops an almost photographic memory, and I think that will come to help him, as you mentioned, with the League of Nations and other things that he's working on. He'll learn how to use a typewriter. He will be able to type at furious speeds. And it was even said that while he was at Princeton University, that he would compose entire essays in his mind before committing them to paper, just because he knew the process that was going to be going on. So I think that we see that here is Woodrow Wilson as a young boy who was having serious side effects, serious health issues, and then he doesn't let it stop him from going to college and obtaining all of these degrees and things. But even while he's doing that, he's very quiet about talking about his health issues. He doesn't even talk to his fiancee and later on his wife about all of the struggles that he's going through.
Yeah, it's not just simply the strokes. He also had asthma, and this was before modern asthma treatments. Of course, he's not the first president to have suffered from asthma. Theodore Roosevelt had suffered from asthma as well, and Theodore Roosevelt actually was just one president before Woodrow Wilson. You had Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and then, of course, Woodrow Wilson. So as Woodrow Wilson's growing up, he is a sickly young man. He possibly has these strokes as a young person. He maybe had become dyslexic because of it. He had asthma. He faced a lot of challenges, and you cannot take away from him the things that he was able to overcome to get where he was. Now, his first known stroke, when we think about his strokes, the first big stroke that he had, of course, was in 1896 when he was teaching at Princeton University. And basically what happened was he noticed that he was weak on his right hand. Several of his fingers had gone numb. He had some pain in his right arm. And it just sort of, he downplayed it. He did downplay it. He didn't necessarily make a big deal out of it, which we're going to see as this being a pattern with Wilson as he suffers stroke after stroke after stroke. He's going to downplay it. He's going to try to say it's really not that big of a deal, when of course it is a big deal. But he does, interestingly enough here, Chris, consult a Dr. William Keene, Keen. And the interesting thing about Keene for our regular listeners is we did a podcast not too terribly long ago on President Grover Cleveland and his surgery on the top left side of his mouth to remove a tumor. William Keene was one of the doctors involved in that surgery, and here he is a number of years later in 1896 being consulted by a future president, not a man who was president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, about this stroke he had had. And interestingly enough, Keene did not consider it to be a very serious medical event, and he actually gave Wilson the green light to go ahead on a vacation to England. Wilson apparently was able to write with his left hand, but it would be several months before he would gain full use of his right hand after that 1896 stroke.
And this was a very serious situation, to the point that even Woodrow Wilson's father, when he noticed the nervous tic that was going on in his facial muscles, his dad said, "I'm afraid that Woodrow's going to die." And here's Woodrow saying, "Oh, I'm fine. It's just I've got a little gastric issue, or I've got a little nausea, but I'm going to be okay." But this was a serious problem. But what I find interesting is that though he was suffering mightily from these health issues, his career and his ambitions are still moving forward. I mean, he is still moving along, but what you're going to start to see is while he's moving along and he's achieving ultimately the president of the university and then later on becoming president of the United States, that the effects of the illnesses are starting to weigh on him. You mentioned how he was told to take a 3-month trip over to England, and they settled in and had a wonderful time there. But what we start to notice by reading diaries and letters and other information is he was having a hard time controlling the irritability, his impatience. He would have these surges of ruthlessness that would become, they're temporary, but they were all symptoms and signs of these strokes and the impact that it had had on his body.
Yeah, and his brother-in-law noted after the 1896 stroke as well that he became more agitated, less less relaxed. He also became more concerned with things going on the national scene. And that, of course, is while he's still just a professor at Princeton University. Now, he's going to become the president of Princeton in 1902. And, Chris, that's going to follow just a few years later with yet another stroke in 1906 that's going to leave him pretty much blind in his left eye. And of course, his doctors at that time are going to tell him, look, dude, you need to slow down. You need to take it easy. But Wilson, what he does is he goes to another doctor who tells him this isn't that big of a deal. And so what he does, he makes another trip to Europe and then returns immediately to Princeton University as president and continues to do his job there as president, trying to make changes at the university and all of that. And he's going to run into some opposition within the university. And then in 1910, he's going to be elected governor of New Jersey, just 2 years before being elected president of the United States. So he did not slow down at all after his 1906 stroke, even though his doctors warned him, you need to slow down.
Yeah, and even his wife writes to a cousin and basically says, it's the reason he's having all these issues is because it's prolonged pressure on his brain and on his nerves, and he's living too tensely, is what she said. And here's the thing that I find very interesting. She says, it is an awful thing, quote, a dying by inches and being incurable. And the thing that is going to cause the most anxiety among the public is that they had the right to know that this individual was dying by the inches, and yet they knew nothing about it. And the commander-in-chief, the one who was leading the nation in a time of war, would be this one who was fit to these terrible, terrible illnesses affecting his ability to govern.
Yeah, and it's only going to be 1913, of course, he's elected president in November of 1913. But in 1913, he has yet another stroke. This one, instead of affecting his right side, this one affects his left side, which, of course, had previously not been impacted with these strokes. So that does show that something's changing. Things are getting worse.
Yeah, and I found it interesting that just a month after his inauguration, that Dr. Weinstein, he was talking about noticing these effects that are going on with Wilson, and talking about that even a month after becoming president, the need to conserve your strength. And there's even a diary that speaks about how Wilson, it was said that it looked as if the people were trying to kill him. He spoke of the loneliness of his position in a way that was extremely saddening. So you have this individual who's just burst onto the scene, who I think we could say he does a really good job of portraying Woodrow Wilson to the public in one manner, but then as soon as the lights go off, he's a totally different person. It has worn him completely out, and he's on the brink of collapse. And so we have the two tales of Woodrow Wilson, but the beauty of History You Didn't Know But Should is that all we know about is the one side of Wilson as he's leading the people out in public. We had no idea of the turmoil and the trauma going on behind the scenes in the White House.
And if you look at video of him before his 1919 stroke, of course, which we'll talk about in a minute, he doesn't look sick. He's walking, he's talking, he's waving, that kind of thing. But then he's going to suffer a tragedy. So his wife in 1914 is going to pass away of a kidney disease. And it's interesting, Chris, as I did some reading on this, when she got sick, he was sort of denying she was as sick as she actually was. And he was doing the same thing with himself, constantly just sort of trying to play it down. I don't think it was just playing it down publicly. I think he was in self-denial, which, people do. They have chest pains and they don't go to the doctor, and it's warning sign after warning sign, and they play down the evidence. So,
well, and I think the other thing, and I know for some reason, unfortunately, we always go back to this. It's a shame to say, but, Woodrow Wilson was not completely faithful to his wife.
No.
He had a friend on the other side that he was writing to, and he would actually take trips away from her, and he actually didn't even hide it really. But I think that he is facing all of these issues of guilt when his wife dies, because he recognizes that the reason she had been prone to this illness, she had also been having fits of depression and self-doubt. And I think he finally recognizes, oh my gosh, she has died because of me. And because of all of my stuff, she stuck by him in the times of his sickness and his strokes. She did all that she could to help him, and yet here he is doing all of these other things, and she basically dies when I think there was a point in which he probably said, it should have been me. Actually, he was a very religious person. You mentioned his dad was a minister, and he's got all of these going on. But there was a moment in which he said, if it was not for the driving power of religion, I wouldn't be alive today. Life wouldn't be worth living.
Yeah.
So you just have this Woodrow Wilson of two people. Mm-hmm. He has got so many different things going on. And honestly, Ray, unless we really spend time looking at this, the public didn't know back in 1915, and we really wouldn't know today. And yet all this is going on around the same time when Germany has just sunk the Lusitania, and you have a nation that doesn't want war but feels it has to go to war, and Woodrow Wilson being pulled in so many different directions. I mean, it's bad enough trying to lead a nation, but trying to control everything else that's going on in addition to that, it must have been a terrible situation.
All the things he was going through, especially you talking about the beginnings of World War I, as it were, these would have tried the health of a normal, healthy man, much less a man who has been suffering strokes. In 1915, he's discovered to have high blood pressure. He's got asthma. He's having these strokes. He's not in good health. And the pressures of World War I and the pressures of Versailles are really going to get to him quite a bit. So 1919 comes along. The war is over. World War I, that is. Like we said earlier, he spent 6 months or so in Europe trying to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, he wins this idea of League of Nations among the Europeans. He also, in 1919, wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't ultimately receive it, I don't think, until 1920, but he still won it. While he's there in Europe in negotiating that treaty, he is struck down, almost dies with Spanish flu. And that's a very interesting thing, because we know privately during the 1918, 1919, 1920 pandemic of Spanish flu, which killed almost 700,000 Americans, he never said anything publicly about it. He never gave a speech. He never put out a press release on it. But we know privately he was very concerned about it. And while he's there in overseas, he's going to suffer a pretty bad case of Spanish flu. He's going to return to the United States. And like we said, Congress is going to want to have nothing to do with his plans to bring about a League of Nations. So he sets off on this 3.5-week trip across the nation. And Chris, once again, he doesn't listen to his doctors. His doctor tells him, no, you don't need to do that. But he forges ahead anyway, despite his health problems, despite everything that's going on. He forges ahead on this trip.
I thought it was interesting that, he was repeatedly told, you're too ill, you can't do this. But one of the things that he says to his doctors is he goes back to the war and he reminds his doctors that in the crucial test of the trenches, he says those soldiers didn't turn their back. They didn't stop fighting. And what Wilson says is they did not turn back, and I cannot turn back now. I cannot put my personal safety, my health in the balance against my duty. I must go. And that is the thing. Regardless how sick he was, to the point where he was not going to physically be able to make it, he put on the best performance that he could. He gave memorable speeches. The crowds loved him. And nobody really knew when the lights were on that anything was wrong with him. Yeah. He goes on this trip and everything's good. The reporters who accompany him, they say, wow, he is enjoying himself and things seem to be going well. He's given a speech every day. This is a very rigorous campaign, if you will, and he does it in the face of reporters and of crowds, and he puts on a good front. but we know that inside, the effects of another stroke is about to happen.
Yeah, and that all comes to a head on September 25, 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado. He's had a bad headache that day. He gives his speech, but then he collapses. His wife, Edith, who he had married in December of 1915, just a few years earlier, finds him very sick, not feeling well. His facial muscles, she said, were twitching uncontrollably. He was seriously nauseated. So they basically put him on a train and head him back to Washington, D.C., because the president is a sick man at that point.
I think it's interesting just to describe to our listeners how sick he was, and there's some context to today. We're in the midst of a pandemic and wearing masks and things of that nature, that his wife, Edith Wilson, said about how sick he was. Quote, "As I sat there watching, I felt that something had broken inside of me. And from that hour on, I would wear a mask, not only to the public, but to the one I loved best in the world.
Mm-hmm.
For he must never know how ill he was, and I must carry on." He was basically on his deathbed.
Yes.
And they didn't know if he was going to make it back to the house alive. And so she put on a mask to hide the concern and the fear that she had, that she was about to lose her husband and the nation was about to lose a president.
Yeah, and they didn't report it. This was not reported. The next day, September 26th, before he was put on the train, they announced his speaking tour had been canceled, but they basically said he just had a stomach ache.
Right.
Basically it was he had a nervous reaction and had some stomach trouble. So they put him on a train, ironically named the Mayflower, and they took him back to Washington on September 28th. When he gets there, he's sick, but he is able to walk through the station without aid. He's waving to people, nodding his hat to people, shaking hands with people. So, maybe on the surface it looked like he was going to get over this. But of course, October 2nd is going to come. And this time, there's going to be no waving at the crowds and all of that. The president woke up on the morning of October 2nd, 1919. His left hand was numb, and then he passed out. Whether he was on the way to the bathroom when he passed out or whether he passed out while he was still in bed, it's disputed. But he did pass out, and Edith Wilson calls the medical team to get assistance to the president because the president was very sick. But Chris, you talked about Edith Wilson putting on that mask. She also put on the role of protector. She became his greatest protector during this time.
Had to be, because the situation was grave. I mean, the doctor, I believe his name was Grayson, recognized after doing a quick examination that the president's left side was paralyzed. He had lost vision in both eyes just about. I mean, he could see very sparingly. His breathing was labored. His voice, which once had a strong tone to it, now was very weak. And if anybody was to come into that room, they would know that the president is not well. And the one thing America did not need at this time was a president who wasn't well or a president that looked weak. And so something had to be done. But there's a problem, right? Because the reporters are used to seeing the president. The crowd's used to seeing the president. I mean, he's been giving speeches. He's been talking. He just walked through that station showing that everything's fine. And so all of a sudden there is discussion that, hey, something's going on. How's he doing from the trip? You had to cut it because of the stomach issues. Is he any better? And the next thing you know, the reporters start asking questions, to which the doctors say, well, he's suffering from nervous exhaustion and some other things, but you can't hide facial expressions for too long before you recognize. Plus, there's still the business of running the country.
Yeah, at this particular point in time, it's interesting because they didn't have the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment is going to come on in 1967. So there's nothing sort of codified really in law about what happens if the president is disabled. Now, Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution did say at this particular time that in the case of the removal of the president from office or his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of said office, the same shall devolve to the vice president, and Congress may by law provide for the case, removal, death, or inability of both the president and vice president. So there really wasn't a process until you come to the 25th Amendment. So Edith Wilson is going to almost be the nation's unofficial president during this time. And the actual vice president, a guy called Thomas Marshall, I'm sure most of our audience have never heard of him, but Thomas Marshall is going to absolutely refuse to take the role of president or to step up, because basically he said that Mrs. Wilson and Dr. Grayson would have to certify in writing that the president, was not able to carry out his duties. So he refused to step up. So Edith just basically becomes president of the United States in an unofficial way. And she's the one. Now, she, of course, claims she didn't make any decisions, that everything was passed through him and all of that. That she was really the one handling the day-to-day office of the chief executive.
Yeah, two points to that. First of all, the administration, I guess the president's closest advisors, if you will, along with the president, they didn't want to remove the president from his position. I mean, one of them actually said, listen, while Woodrow Wilson is lying in that White House, I'm not going to be a party to ousting him. That's not on me. That man, he's been good to me. He's taken care of me, and I am not going to take the presidency away from him. And they also had to tell Edith, you got to tell the vice president. They didn't even want to tell the vice president. Yep. They wanted to keep that quiet and, say, look, you've got to tell them that this is happening. Now, maybe they thought that Marshall might have wanted it, but Marshall, he wanted to stay far away from it as he possibly could. And he was like, I don't like the idea. And I think the reason he didn't want to be president is because, during that time, the vice president had no responsibilities. Yep. I mean, had a pretty easy job, if you will.
And a lot of times they didn't even really know the president. They didn't have a relationship with the president. So it's not so much today where you see the president, the vice president walking out by the White House laughing and chit-chatting. It wasn't like that at all.
No, and there is a report that says when Marshall was told that the president is not doing well and you might have to step up, that his face changed. He became pale. He was scared because he didn't know what he was about to enter. I mean, going from vice president to president back during that day, as you just said, it is completely different. I mean, it's moving to a new part of the world and nobody to help you because you don't know what's about to happen. And so I think Edith, a lot of people can look at Edith and say, well, was she manipulating the situation? No, I think what she was doing is trying to protect her husband. She's trying to protect the country, and she's trying to protect the vice president that doesn't want to be it. And she knows if this gets out, there will be a crisis. And we've talked over and over about this, that when the nation doesn't have a strong leader, or they know that the leader is sick, that the nation can spin off into a crisis, whether it's financial, whether it's some other aspect. And so you've got a small group of people who are trying to handle what needs to happen on this thing. And it's interesting. We have this thing that's going on while President Wilson is sick. Remember, there's this frenzy of the Red Scare that's going on during this time, when people are afraid that there are people in the government who might be trying to overthrow the government. And so that's going on. And, maybe our listeners are aware of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer and the Palmer raids, where they would just go out and they would round up these alleged communist people by the thousands and deport them. So there's a good belief that Woodrow Wilson has no idea that this is going on, that his attorney general is rounding up all of these people illegally and doing all of these things that are just immoral and wrong, that he has no idea. He doesn't sign off on it. He's not a part of it. But bills are not being signed. Things are not happening. But who's the one that's taking notes? Who's the one that's keeping track? Who's the one that's advising? It's Edith.
Yeah, I mean, she's the one that decides what gets his attention, what doesn't. Laying in that bed in the White House or whatever he was doing, he wasn't aware of what his attorney general was doing. I mean, based on previous strokes, it's likely he couldn't read really well for a while. So, there's definitely a lot going on that he may not have really paid attention to. And what I want to stress to our listeners at this particular point is the length of time that this has happened. He has his stroke in 1919, the end of 1919, September and October of 1919. He had just taken his second term in 1918. So we're talking about 3 years where Edith, for all intents and purposes, is president.
And he's just taken over this second term. He doesn't have a lot of people on his side.
No.
He is not this well-liked, well-received president. The League of Nations, I mean, when the whole European nations agreed to it, but your own people were completely against it. He's trying to get this peace treaty resolved and get it settled. And people were very wary of President Wilson. I'm reminded of one final story of when a senator came to see Wilson while he was in his bed,
mm-hmm.
and his arms were hidden under the blankets,
mm-hmm.
and
yep.
Edith is taking notes. And I remember, I think it was Senator Fall, but he came and visited Wilson, and they were talking for a few minutes. And as the senator got up to go, he took President Wilson's hand and he said, "Well, Mr. President, we've all been praying for you." And Wilson looked at him and said, "Well, which way is that, Senator?"
Yeah. Which way is that? What way are you praying
right.
for me? To get better or to fall off the side of the table?
Exactly.
Yeah. Which way? Well, Wilson, of course, is going to end his presidency, in March of 1921. He's going to live about 3 more years, and he's going to die in Washington, D.C. at his home on February 3, 1924. And it's interesting, his last words to his wife was as follows. He says, quote, "I am a broken piece of machinery. When the machinery is broken, I am ready." And then later, he's going to die. Those are going to be his last words to Edith and to anybody who else who was in the room. So very interesting information about our 28th president of the United States. And maybe one day we'll come back and look at some other aspect of the life of the President of the United States. So, Chris, great episode. Hope our listeners enjoyed it. If you'd like to contact us, you can always email us at historyyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Sounder FM, Google Podcasts. We're all over the place. So until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.